There we go. Can you hear me? Bingo. There we go. Awesome. Thank you all for worshiping with us today. Hey, I haven't seen a spontaneous stand-up since my youth group days, so that was great. We haven't sung this. That's right. That was great. So thank you all for worshiping with us this morning. There are several times in life when I look around and I see something. I think we've come a long way in the way we've created things or invented things. And in this week, one of the examples I thought of was the tent. So throughout history, we've come from something like this to something like that. That thing's got a porch on it, right? That's an incredible piece of development right there. Growing up, my home congregation, we did this mission trip to this tiny village in Mexico. Aquiles was the town, and there are just dirt roads to get there. There are no hotels. There are nothing like that. And there's this piece of property on the side of the mountain that the church owns there in Aquiles. And so when we would go to Mexico, we would camp. Like we would set up tents in this field, and we would all spread out as much as we could and find our little spot. And for the week that we were there, we would stay in tents. Now, the first time I went, I remember vividly because it was all new, and this was the first time I really been camping. We didn't camp much growing up. So I had some friends and one of my friends had a tent, so I knew that we had a place to stay. So literally I took a sleeping bag and my clothes, and we got there, found our spot, pitched our tent, and very quickly I realized that there were some tricks to this that we were unaware of, being our first time. The first was that we wanted two things out of a campsite. One was that you wanted it to be kind of flat, and second was you wanted to be a long ways away from the outhouses. We were 0 for 2. Yeah, 0 for 2. So we cleared some rocks, and we were a little tardy getting our tent and everything set up, so all the good spots had been taken. But yeah, we were 0 for 2 on the main things we were looking for. And then as the week started going, I noticed that there were some other tricks that people who had done this before had thought of that we had not. Like people brought air mattresses. That would have been a good idea. That would have been nice. I'm like, okay, so there are some tricks here. Some people brought some kind of like battery-powered fans. I'm like, that's a good idea. Some lanterns, some things. They were obviously more prepared, right, than I was. And then I mentioned that one of the things you're looking for in this campsite was a level piece of ground, and that ours was not. It wasn't incredibly slanted, and at first I didn't really notice. And then the first morning I woke up with the worst headache I've ever had in my life. And I realized that I was sleeping downhill. Yeah, so I made sure to point myself the other direction, and things got a little better. And then there were some people who had tents like this. Right? In fact, a couple years later, my mom started going as the nurse. And I can't remember exactly what happened, but I got injured slightly on one of the work projects, and so doubly embarrassing, I had to go to the nurse who was my mom and say, look, and she said, oh yeah, well I'm sharing a tent with so-and-so. Our tent's right around the corner. It's the red one. If you go over there, my first aid kit's in there, and I'll fix you up. And I remember going to this tent and opening the door, and it was something like this. And I may be exaggerating in my mind, but I feel like it had like 8-foot ceilings. Like it was a tent, and I walked in and I could stand up straight. And there were rooms in there, like they each had a side and like a zipper. I thought, this is the way to go. If we're coming to a tent again, we need something like this. We're in the middle, we're actually in week 2 of our Thanksgiving series that we're calling Come to the Table. And in this Thanksgiving series, we are looking at some of the big, important festivals and feasts that the Israelites practiced throughout the Old Testament, and especially into the time of Jesus and into today. A lot of these festivals are still practiced and are still huge deals for our Jewish friends. And so last week, we began with a festival, a feast, that they practice every single week. And that is the beginning of Sabbath. So a lot of Jewish families will begin at dusk the day before Sabbath on Friday evening, and they'll have a huge meal together. And then Saturday would be the Sabbath where they would rest together and play and rejoice in the favor of the Lord. And so we talked about the Sabbath. We talked about the roots of the Sabbath and the beginning of the Sabbath. And we talked about Jesus' interaction with the Sabbath. We could tell that what God intended was not really caught up all the way through, because when Jesus comes, who is the full representation of God, Jesus keeps getting in trouble on the Sabbath. And 9 times out of 10, Jesus gets in trouble on the Sabbath because he's healing people on the Sabbath. And we talked about that Jesus knew something about the Sabbath that we didn't. And that was that the Sabbath is for the healing of God's people. And this week, we're going to look at a huge festival. It's, I would argue, the second biggest in all of Jewish history. We're going to talk about the festival or the Feast of Tabernacles today. The Feast of Tabernacles is the Feast of many names. You may hear it referred to by several different ways. The Feast of Tabernacles, of course. It could also be called the Feast of Booths. It could also be called the Feast of the Ingathering. You might hear it by its Jewish name, Sukkot. Or, in a lot of scriptures, it is so well known that it is just known as the feast. The Feast of the Ingathering, the Feast of Booths, the Feast of Tabernacles. This one is probably the closest to our version of Thanksgiving. You might have noticed one of the names in there was the Feast of the Ingathering. And so the feast a feast to honor God's provision in their lives. So on one side, there is God's provision of crops and of food. And so at harvest, they would gather in all of their crops. And then this is part of this celebration of the Feast of Tabernacles. But on the other hand, the book of the Exodus is the story of the rescue of God's people and of how God provided for not just food, but also provided water and provided direction for his people in the wilderness as they escape Egypt. After God's miraculous intervention at the beginning of the book of Exodus and God's people's eventual release from captivity, the Israelites were led by God into the desert where they wandered for 40 years before they reached the promised land. But this wandering was deeply formational for God's people. They weren't lost in the conventional sense, and they weren't alone. The entire way, for 40 years in the wilderness, God spoke with them and to them, and God provided for them. He provided food from the sky. He provided water from a rock. He provided direction in the form of the pillar of the cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. And in the wilderness, God protected them. He sheltered them. And this is the idea that God is trying to communicate with the Festival of Tabernacles. This is the idea that God does not want his people to forget. Leviticus 23. The Lord said to Moses, "Say to the Israelites, on the 15th day of the 7th month of the Lord's Festival of Tabernacles begins. And it lasts for 7 days. The first day is a sacred assembly. Do no regular work. For 7 days present food offerings to the Lord, and on the 8th day hold a sacred assembly and present a food offering to the Lord. It is the closing special assembly. Do no regular work." So beginning with the 15th day of the 7th month, after you have gathered the crops of the land, celebrate the festival to the Lord for 7 days. The first day is a day of Sabbath rest, and the 8th day is also a day of Sabbath rest. On the first day you are to take branches from luxuriant trees, from palms, willows, and other leafy trees, and rejoice before the Lord your God for 7 days. Celebrate this as a festival to the Lord for 7 days each year. This is to be a lasting ordinance for generations to come, celebrated in the 7th month. Live in temporary shelters for 7 days. All native-born Israelites are to live in such shelters, so your descendants will know that I had the Israelites live in temporary shelters when I brought them out of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. So God says in Leviticus, we're going to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles. And what I want you to do is take all of these branches of these beautiful trees, and I want you to build a tent. And for 7 days, I want you to live in them, to remember the wilderness. To this day, people do this. Here's a picture, a more recent picture from Jerusalem. You can see a little structure built out in the alleyway or outside of their home, and you can see the branches laid across the top. And here's a more contemporary version. This is from a home in New Hampshire, a pretty elaborate tent, a tabernacle, where they've laid the branches across the top. And still to this day, for 7 days during the Feast of Tabernacles, our Jewish friends will go live in that to remind themselves that their ancestors were in the desert and that their ancestors lived in tents. They lived in little tabernacles. And these shelters, sometimes we think of the story of the Exodus and we think about how wandering in the wilderness for 40 years was pseudo-punishment. And it was a little bit. But also, as we mentioned, this was formational for God's people. And they don't celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles to remember the punishment part. They do it and they remember the provision that God gave. They remember the incredible fact that God provided shelter for them. We hear this in the book of Isaiah, chapter 4. Then the Lord will create over all of Mount Zion and over all those who assemble there a cloud of smoke by day and a glow of flaming fire by night. You hear Exodus in there? Over everything the glory will be a canopy. It will be a shelter and a shade from the heat of the day, and a refuge and a hiding place from the storm, from the rain. So not only was the festival itself a big deal, it was one of the biggest festivals in the lives of God's people. It was one of Israel's pilgrimage fests, which means that all native-born Israelites had to return to Jerusalem to celebrate this together. So they'd make the journey to Jerusalem, and all of this tent building was happening in the city of Jerusalem. So you can imagine all these people have made the pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and now they're building their temporary shelters, and there were just shelters everywhere. J.V. Valling in his book described it like this. At Jerusalem, it was a gala day. It was to the autumn pilgrims who arrived on the 14th day like entrance into a sylvan city. Roofs and courtyards, streets and squares, roads and gardens were green with boughs of citron and myrtle, palm and willow. This painting comes from the mid-1800s somewhere, but it's a slight, I don't know if the tents looked that good, but this is a slight representation of coming into Jerusalem and just seeing the green tents all over the place. Anywhere anyone could find a place to put up a tent, they would. Jerusalem would have just been covered. The Festival of Tabernacles will come to play a huge role, as you can imagine, in so many parts of our Bible. So many big stories happen at the Feast of Tabernacles. Everyone has descended upon Jerusalem for 8 days. This would have been a pretty important setting for big things to happen, and it does. In the book of Nehemiah, as God's people are rebuilding their temple, and really they're trying to rebuild their identities together, they come across the book of the law and they read and realize they have not been celebrating the Festival of Tabernacles. So the prophet Ezra reads to them and says, we got to do this. Go and get your branches. And in Nehemiah chapter 8, we read, so the people went out, and they brought back branches, and they built themselves temporary shelters on their own roofs, in their courtyards, in the courts of the house of God, and in the square by the water gate, and the one by the gate of Ephraim. The whole company that had returned from exile built temporary shelters, and they lived in them. From the days of Joshua, son of Nun, until that day, the Israelites had not celebrated it like this, and their joy was very great. In 1 Samuel chapter 1, we read the story of the birth of Samuel, if you remember that story. Samuel's mother, her name was Hannah, and Hannah was in deep distress. So Hannah goes to the temple to pray, and she's praying so fervently and so deeply that she's just pouring out her heart to God, and her lips are moving, but no words are coming out. And the prophet Eli looks at her and thinks she's drunk. And we always wonder that, like, why does Eli think she's drunk? She's at the temple praying. He thinks she's drunk because they're at the Feast of Tabernacles, and they've been feasting for 7 days. And so he looks at her and says, they just got done with the feast at Shiloh, and he looks at her and he says, cut the wine out. You're drunk. You're here at the temple. And she says, oh, no. I haven't been drinking. My heart is in anguish. And so she tells Eli. And Eli prays for her, and the Lord blesses her, and this is the birth of Samuel. At the end of the book of Zechariah, the prophet declares that one day all nations that have fought against and attacked Jerusalem will convene upon Jerusalem, and they will all celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles together. And it is at the Feast of Tabernacles that we find two of Jesus' biggest and most influential teachings in John chapter 7 and John chapter 8. By Jesus' day, the festival had kind of evolved some, and it included two giant ceremonies. The first was to commemorate the events that occur in Exodus 17. We'll read Exodus 17, beginning in verse 1. The whole Israelite community set out from the desert of Sin, traveling from place to place as the Lord commanded. They camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. So they quarreled with Moses, and they said, give us water to drink. Moses replied, why do you quarrel with me? Why do you put the Lord to the test? But the people were thirsty for water there. and they grumbled against Moses. They said, "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to make us and our children and livestock die of thirst?" Then Moses cried out to the Lord, "What am I going to do with these people? They're almost ready to stone me." And the Lord answered Moses, "Go out in front of the people. Take with you some of the elders of Israel and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile and go. I will stand there before you by the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock and water will come out of it for the people to drink." So every day during the Feast of Tabernacles, a priest would lead a parade. He would carry a golden pitcher, and he would lead them out of the temple down to the pool of Siloam. And there he would fill the pitcher full of water, and the parade would follow him back through the streets to the temple, and the ceremony would end in front of the altar to the Lord. While they walked, they sang a section of our Old Testament. They would sing a section called the Hallel, which is Psalms 113 through 118. So let's just envision this ceremony for a second. Put yourself there. You're in Jerusalem for the Feast of Tabernacles. Everybody has convened back for this enormous 8-day celebration. And every day there is this water ceremony where we remember that God poured water out of the rock at Horeb. And as they reached the end of Psalm 117, they would shout, "Give thanks to the Lord," 3 times. And then they would pour the water out onto the altar of God. And on the last day of the festival, they would do this parade. They would do this march 7 times. 7 times from the temple down to the pool, fill it up with water, march it back singing the songs and pour it out to the Lord. And then they would do it again and again and again. John chapter 7. On the last and greatest day of the festival, as the water ceremony is being performed again and again and again, Jesus stood and in a loud voice said, "Let anyone who is thirsty come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as Scripture has said, rivers of living water will flow from within them." Whoa. Also, every night at the Festival of Tabernacles, they ended with a special ritual. As the sky grew dark, the crowd would gather together in the temple, and they would light 4 large ceremonial torches. And then the people would hold smaller torches, and they would dance and sing and celebrate God's light, the light that guided them in the darkness in the wilderness, the presence of God that would never leave them, the light that showed the way in the darkness. And on the last day, the party was especially joyful. After all, it's the last night. And historians have written about the glow that emanated from the temple on those nights. The temple would have been strategically built on the highest point in the city. And so on these nights, as they gathered together and they danced and they celebrated and they lit their torches, the light from the temple would shine out onto the city. John chapter 8. When Jesus spoke to the people again, he said, "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." In our little campsite there in Mexico, it was just this giant tent city, just tents all over the place, except for 2 structures that were kind of out toward the front of the entry. We called them, with good intentions, the old man house and the old lady house. Because we had some people who had been on this trip for decades, and they were very well connected to the people of Aquiles. But camping was kind of out of their expectations. Right? They couldn't sleep on the floor anymore, so we had 2 little houses we called the old man house and the old lady house. And they were pretty rudimentary, but they did have a couple of hanging light bulbs, and they had a couple of cots for beds. And at first when we got there, it was like we all camped out, and we were excited to camp. We were excited to be in the tent and do the thing. 3 or 4 days in, you're working all day, and you're running around with kids at VBS, and you get back and you have dinner and you go in, and the call of the house starts to get a lot more tempting. And we started talking with each other about, wouldn't it be nice to have a place that was flat? Wouldn't it be nice to have a place with a bed that was up off the ground a little bit? Because there's something about the house that even the nicest tent just can't provide. There's a certain level of insulation. There's a certain level of concrete flooring. There's a certain level of protection, of provision that you feel from being inside a house that even the most glamorous tent just doesn't do for you. And this is the jump that Jesus is making in John 7 and John 8. That the provision that God provided in the desert, it had nothing to do with what they lived in. And this is why the people stayed outside of their homes on those days. To remember that the provision and the protection doesn't come from the house that they live in. The protection and the provision comes from God. And even in a tent, even in a temporary shelter, even one that's leaning together by boughs of trees and leaves, is there that God provides protection. It's not found in your home. It's found in God. And Jesus is going to take it a step forward. Jesus is calling to them at the Festival of Tabernacles, and he's saying, we are remembering correctly that God provided all these things for us and that he provided them for your ancestors, and it's now through me that God provides this permanently for eternity. As they do the water ritual, Jesus says, I'm that water. I'm the water that poured from the rock at Horeb. I'm the one that gives you drink forever. And as they do the light ceremony, Jesus says, yeah, God led you through the wilderness with a pillar of fire, and now it's me, forever, for all eternity. Jesus says those things that God did in Exodus, God is still doing, and God is still working, and now it comes from me. The world is a tough place, right? It's easy sometimes to feel like we're wandering in the wilderness ourselves at moments. This month, as we start to think about our own feast holiday, may we remember the teachings of the Feast of Tabernacles, that God is still providing. God is still with us. And it doesn't really matter what our area looks like. It doesn't really matter what our home looks like. It could be a very protected, isolated home where you feel safe and secure. And it can also be a tent, because it's not the home that provides that protection. It is God. It is God who leads us. And through Jesus, that happens forever. If we can introduce you to this Jesus or help you on that faith journey today, would you come and find me as we stand? And Alfred leads us in one more song.